Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. We are in the virtual reading group here, and we are reading the book Essays in Understanding, edited by Jerry Cohn. And last week and this week, we are reading two essays. Last week, Understanding in Politics. This week, The Nature of Totalitarianism, which very much go together. They were written as one essay or one longer typescript, apparently part of a book. Not in, a new book has come out claiming that they're part of a book that Arendt called The Modern Challenge to Tradition. And I think that's probably true. It's a book she never really got very far into, and in the end, many of the parts of it ended up in different places. As you saw last week, Understanding in Politics was published in the Partisan Review in 1953. This part on the nature of totalitarianism was never published as this essay. That said, it is very much in line with the epilogue, what became the epilogue to the Origins of Totalitarianism on Ideology and Terror. And, for those of you who've read that epilogue, you'll see that what is here in The Nature of Totalitarianism tracks that very closely. This period of Arendt's from 1952 until 1955 is in many ways, again, this is my opinion, perhaps the most intellectually rich and productive of her life, of her career. She has finished The Origins of Totalitarianism. As I've said a number of times, she's somewhat dissatisfied with the conclusion or the lack of conclusion. And she is trying to sort of dig deeper, after writing this huge book, incredibly important and popular book, and ask, what is totalitarianism? And as she's doing that, she's also pushing herself to think about totalitarianism and what does it mean for us today in the modern world? That it's not simply a historical project, that there's something deeply modern about it, and that in understanding totalitarianism, we're understanding ourselves and serious problems that we have to confront. As we talked about in the last session, and since these two essays go together, I just want to remind us, her interest is in understanding, right? Understanding is not the same as social science. It's a complicated process. It's like reconciliation, and by reconciliation, which she doesn't mean forgiveness, understanding is unending. It's an unending activity in which we try and be at home in the world, but not in the sense of being a home in the world where we accept it and sort of reconcile ourselves to it in some sort of unthinking way, in which we try and understand it, come at home to it, and at times resist it. And what does it mean to reconcile something and to resist it? Well, it means to reconcile ourselves to the fact that this is who we are, and who we are needs to be resisted, and the world we are in needs to be resisted. And thus, understanding and reconciliation for her are to make the world meaningful in such a way that we prepare a new resourcefulness of the human mind to resist and battle the world as it is. And that's what, and we have to confront this reality, reconcile ourselves to the reality that we have ruined our categories of thoughts and our standards of judgment. And that politics now is the effort to Verwurzelung, dig new roots, and in digging new roots, build a new world, build a new common world. We have to take seriously the loss of the world, the break of tradition, reconcile ourselves to it. And it's only then that we can begin the work of understanding and politics to build a world. If that's the first essay, right, the one we talked about last week, well, what is the nature of totalitarianism? In a way, well, which comes first, right? I mean, why is that one first and this one second? The nature of totalitarianism is about what is totalitarianism, and why are we asking that? How does that relate to understanding in politics? Because it is totalitarianism, as she says in numerous places, that is the factual moment of the break with tradition, the factual moment of the loss of our concepts of thinking and the loss of our standards. And so to reconcile ourselves to that world, we need to reconcile ourselves to totalitarianism. I didn't make a mistake in saying that, right? This is, I think, one of the most radical claims that Arendt makes in the epilogue and in her work in this era. We have to reconcile ourselves to totalitarianism. Now, again, that does not mean that we make peace with it. It means that we reconcile ourselves to the fact that totalitarianism emerges in the 20th century not as an accident, not as, something Hitler did in Germany and Stalin did in the Soviet Union, and if we get rid of Hitler and Stalin, we get rid of it. It is part of the modern world, and it arises out of the modern world. So to reconcile ourselves to totalitarianism is to face and confront the real world as it is, which is a world that is has a predilection to and is prepared for, and in some sense, and this is the hard part, needs totalitarianism. She's going to argue that totalitarianism answers a fundamental need of the modern world. Now, that's not to say that she's certainly not justifying it. She's saying that we have to face and confront this truth, this reality, that totalitarianism isn't an accident. And so if that's the case, we need to understand what totalitarianism is. And we need to understand what it is in modernity that predisposes us or makes us prepared for totalitarianism. And we do that not to sort of make peace with totalitarianism, but because only in understanding and fully confronting the dangers of our time can we be pushed to the work of politics, which is the Verwurzelung, the sort of building of new roots, the digging of new roots of a new world that will allow us to engage in the work of politics to build a new world. Okay. This essay, again, is very much along the lines of the epilogue. It has a prologue in which the question is raised about what totalitarianism is, and we turned to Kant and Montesquieu to frame that question. The turn to Montesquieu and Kant is that what they saw, right, is that in a profound way, if the moral structure of society breaks down, right? So what Montesquieu understood is that there's a legal structure of society and then there's customs. And he says, look, if the legal structure of society breaks down, that's bad, but we're still okay as long as we have customs, a foundation that hold us in check in some way. But if that second level, the customs break down, if the moral foundations break down, then we're in trouble. And so she starts off on the first page of this essay on nature of totalitarianism, and says, look, we have a problem, right? There's a breakdown of the whole structure of morality. And she says, people say that, well, to say that is to be like a prophet of doom. And she's like, well, Kant was a prophet of doom. Kant said, once the moral structure of civilization breaks down, all we have left is the balance of power, and the balance of power is not going to work. And Montesquieu was a prophet of doom, insofar as Montesquieu says that you can't just divide central power. You have to also have the principle of constitutional or republican government, virtue and equality. And if those go, there's no saving us. And so she says, are these people really prophets of doom as well? We can go into Montesquieu and Kant a little bit later in the questions if people have questions about them. But basically, what Montesquieu is known for, and what Kant and what Arendt really loves about him, is that Montesquieu sees that there's three kinds of government, right? He calls forms of government, natures of government. There's constitutional or republican government, there's monarchical government, and there's tyrannical government. And that's old. I mean, Aristotle and Plato and others have already said that. What Montesquieu adds to that is that there's a principle of action of all of these, such that virtue is the principle of action for constitutional government, honor for monarchical government, and fear for tyrannical government. But then she says there's actually a third level that we need to look at, which is not the nature or the principle of action, but the ground of the fundamental ground underlying them, the ground of action. And what she says is that in a republican form of government, the ground of action is a fundamental experience of equality of men, right? That the way to be to be happy is a real experience of joy in understanding that we are all limited and we share power. And in a monarchy, where we have a kind of desire for honor, the fundamental experience is one of distinction, that we find joy and happiness in difference, not in equality, in distinction, in showing, well, there's a kind of vanity, as she says, vanity and a love for vanity. And she says both these fundamental experiences are deeply human, vanity and a love of equality. And she says Montesquieu doesn't actually say what the fundamental ground experience of tyranny is, right? The principle of action is fear, but what's the ground experience? And she says, actually, what it is anxiety. It's this deep loneliness or anxiety that one man alone has no power, and he could be overwhelmed by others. And this leads to what she calls a lust for power, or the will to power. This is on page 336 to 337. And so she says, this is what Montesquieu left out, this turn to anxiety. And she adds this to his distinction. And so that this anxiety and fear together lead to a lust for power, and that tyranny is thus based not only in fear, but in this, and this is on the top of page 338, tyranny is based on the essential impotence of all men who are alone. It is the hubristic attempt to be like God. So tyranny has its root experience this feeling of utter loneliness, impotence, of being abandoned, of being left to oneself, in which out of that fear and anxiety, what one wants is to be super powerful and to be like God. So she's now said, all right, this is Montesquieu, right? and this is sort of the academic part. We've looked at Montesquieu, looked at his ideas, and now what we want to do is extend this. We want to say Montesquieu talked about constitutional republics, he talked about monarchies, and he talked about tyrannies. Obviously, he didn't talk about totalitarian governments that didn't exist yet. We need to now ask the question, if totalitarianism is something radically new, if it's a new form of government, and Arendt clearly thinks it is, what is its principle? So, just like the others have the principles of fear, virtue, and honor, what is its principle? And what is its fundamental experience, right? Whereas one fundamental experience is the basic equality, and another is distinction, and the third is anxiety. And so here what she's going to do is look for, in parts 2 and 3 of the essay, ask the question, can totalitarianism have a principle and a ground of this human condition on Earth? And she's going to say it does, and she's going to, and now we're going to have the 3 core ideas of how she comes in the early 1950s to understand totalitarianism, which she did not figure out in the first volume and first edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism. And those 3 core elements are terror, ideology, and loneliness, right? Terror, she's going to say, is the essence of totalitarianism. It is what drives it. But if terror is the principle of action, what it actually seeks to set in motion is not any particular thing, but motion itself. Because what totalitarianism is a movement, a constant movement of overcoming. And in this sense, what terror does is it so fully terrorizes people that it prepares them to be completely fungible, to be completely adaptable. And thus it prepares people to be both executioner and victim, and to fully actualize a logical reality. And in this sense, terror is what translates ideology into reality. What is ideology? This is the second key thing. Ideology for Arendt is the arrogant emancipation from reality and experience. The 2 main ideologies she talks about here and in so many of her works are the 2 that led to totalitarianisms in the 20th century. One is racism, Nazism. And in this sense, the ideology is not that race is important, but that we are going to make the society fundamentally structured in reality, in objective reality, on racial superiority and inferiority. And the other is communism. Again, not saying that class is important or equality is important, but saying that there are certain dying classes and there are certain ruling classes, and our job is to actually create a reality dominated by the ruling classes. This ideology is, therefore, the content of it is not important. It doesn't matter if you're racist or classist or or some other ist or ism. What matters is that you have some idea that can become a logical, that can be taken to its logical conclusion, such that you have an idea of transforming reality. And the problem with reality for totalitarianism is that it is inconsistent and it is unpredictable. And what does totalitarianism need? It needs predictability and consistency. The problem is you have an ideology of predictability and consistency. You have reality which resists it. How do you fix it? And the answer is terror. Terror is what makes the world consistent and keeps it that way. So if you have an ideology that says all Jews are vermin, that starts with racism, you need terror to actually make Jews vermin in camps or by taking away all their property so they become beggars in order to make the world fit your ideology. And so it's this working together of ideology and terror that becomes the principle of totalitarianism. I mean, I'll be honest. She tries to fit this into the Montesquieuian scheme, and sometimes she says that terror is the nature or essence, and ideology is the principle. Sometimes it's a little more complicated than that. I think what's going on is she's saying that they work together in this way, because terror is the essence, but the essence is terror because it is seeking to fit the world to an ideology. And so the principle of action of a regime, of totalitarianism, and she says, is ideology, not a particular one, but ideology in itself, which means logicality, pure logicality. And thus, the point of totalitarianism is not to actually actualize a particular ideology. It really doesn't matter. It's just to turn people into press them together into this band of terror so that they will basically do what you tell them, to actualize a law, a natural law of racism or of communism. And you can go back and forth one to the other, she says. It actually doesn't matter. And thus the key to it is the loss of distinction between truth and falsity, and the idea that everything is possible. If that's the principle of totalitarianism, just like virtue is the principle of constitutional government and honor is the principle of monarchical government and fear is the principle of tyranny, what is the ground, right? The human ground, the experience, the new experience that underlies such a government as totalitarianism, which has its essence and principle in terror and ideology. And here's where she says that the human condition, a new experience has emerged that was never in the world before, that makes totalitarianism possible, but I think it's actually stronger than that. Makes totalitarianism almost, well, an answer to, a solution to the problem. And that new experience is what she calls loneliness. Now, it's of course not the case that loneliness never existed in the world before. But what she wants to say is that there's a new idea of loneliness here, a new understanding of loneliness, and that this loneliness is a kind of utter abandonment of institutions and people in such a way that there's simply a complete feeling of utter abandonment. So she says on page 358, in the middle of the page, loneliness as the concomitant of homelessness and uprootedness is, humanly speaking, the very disease of our time. What does she mean? Loneliness as the concomitant, as the corollary of, as what comes with homelessness and uprootedness is, humanly speaking, the very disease of our time. Homelessness and uprootedness, what do they mean? For Arendt, homelessness means that we, not just that we're, not obviously that we have people on the streets homeless. It means that we have lost the very understanding and belief and conviction that we might have a home, that we may have a place to be at home. It's the loss of nation. It's the loss of ethnic people. It's the idea that we are all individuals, and as individuals, we have no roots and home, and that's rootlessness too. We are set adrift in the modern world, and we have to make ourselves. And the human experience, so humanly speaking, this sense of homelessness and rootlessness and being without a kind of purpose. So what does a religion or a nation give us? It gives us a sense, well, I may be poor, and I may have bad luck, I may have a bad year, there may be a pandemic, a lot of bad things happen to us all the time. But a nation and a religion and belonging to a people gives us a sense that in spite of all that, I'm part of something bigger. I'm part of a home. I'm rooted in a world. And even if I die, and even if I'm unhappy, I know that what I'm part of matters. It's created by God. It's given, by tradition, and it matters. And therefore, even though I'm insignificant, I'm a louse, to quote Dostoevsky, I'm part of something bigger than me. And what she's really after is the loss of that feeling that I'm part of something bigger than me. And that's what she calls the disease of our time. And she says, to be sure, you may still see people, but they get to be fewer and fewer who cling to each other as if in midair, without the help of established channels of communication provided by a commonly inhabited world, in order to escape together the curse of becoming inhuman in a society where everybody seems to be superfluous and is so perceived by their fellow man. So we do still have friends, right? We still do talk to people, but fewer and fewer people in doing that can actually feel part of something meaningful. We feel we are increasingly without the help of established channels, nation, religion, a small town, whatever it is. And we're increasingly alone in the sense of being superfluous. And that's this idea of loneliness that she means. And it's out of that idea of loneliness, of superfluity, that we need and we crave a purpose, to belong to something, to be part of something that gives our lousy lives some meaning or significance. And that's where ideology comes in, an ideological movement. Now, again, not ideology simply in the sense of my race is better than your race. That's not good enough. Not ideology in the sense of, class, we want my class to get some more benefits than your class, because those ideologies are still partial. They still engage in the world of politics, give and take. But when the ideology says, my race is so better than yours that we're going to exterminate yours, and all we're going to have is mine, and we're going to drive that to its conclusion, and there's going to be no other real obstacles that we're going to let get in the way of that. That's when ideology has to invoke terror in order to actualize its world. And it has to press people together in this iron band to make them complicit, so that they will go to their death as victims or assist you as executioners. And that, she says, is the essence of totalitarianism. That's the nature of totalitarianism. If that's the nature of totalitarianism, how does it matter for us today, right? Because that's the claim. One way it matters for us today is that since it's rooted in a fundamentally human experience of homelessness, rootlessness, and loneliness. And since that fundamental experience is our modern disease still, A, totalitarianism is an ever-present danger. B, what's going to stop totalitarianism from happening is not an awareness of its horrors, but as she says on the first page of the essay, an awareness of and a desire for freedom, and an understanding that totalitarianism can only answer our need to be cured of loneliness through the radical denial of freedom. And then 3, that if we succeed in preventing a new totalitarianism from emerging, which I think she thinks is likely, although it's not clear, there will be other movements and other new governments and other social changes that happen that seek to provide the solution to the problem of loneliness that totalitarianism sought to provide in the 20th century. And so we have to be aware of those, of totalitarianism and where it's grounded and what it is, both to fight it, be aware that it's a radical denial of freedom so we can resist it, but also so that we can see and be aware that it is likely that other new organizations will emerge that seek to answer the problem it had sought to answer in the mid-20th century. And we have to be able to resist those as well. And then third, we have to understand this so that in understanding and doing the work of politics, we can begin to root down and think about what would it mean to build a new world? Does it mean trying to create new homes and new roots, in a sense, going back to what was pre-modern? I don't think Arendt thinks that's possible. And so this is where she develops this idea that what we have to do is learn to reconcile ourselves and root ourselves in a world without roots, in a world without homes, and find the joy in that, so that instead of feeling abandoned and thus in the need of some ideological consistency through terror, we can find the joy in, and the human joy in, living in a world without pillars, without traditions, without truths. That's the challenge that she poses for herself and ourselves in the modern world. How do we root ourselves in a broken world? Not going back and trying to create a fixed world, but root ourselves in a broken world. And that's her project. It may be, I think some people would say, well, that's beyond utopian. And I think there's some truth to that. Anyway, I'll stop there. These are incredibly rich essays. I left so much out in going over this. I realized that this is a very deep and rich essay, so I'm hoping you guys will bring up parts I didn't talk about, and we can have a great discussion. Again, if you feel the need to respond directly to someone, we're going to try it this week, where I welcome you to let me know, and I'll ask you to keep it brief, and we can do that. All that said, Susan, you're up first.
Where am I? Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So there was so much in here, but one thing that I really appreciated on page 349 was her making the distinction, which I've struggled with for a long time, between Nazism and Stalinism. And she says, as we've all learned to our sorrow, it does not matter whether this ideology is as stupid and barren of authentic spiritual content as racism, or whether it is as saturated with the best of our tradition as socialism. And I've always struggled with that, that what Stalin did was in the name of something that we all could relate to and were drawn to. So I appreciated her making that distinction. The other question I had is toward the end, where she says logicality is the vice of solitude. And I was a little taken aback because, of course, she talks about solitude as something we all need to think. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how solitude leads to certain vices and what to do with that.
Okay, great. Thanks. Those are both good points. Yeah, and on the first point, I'll leave it with what you said. I think it's an important distinction. You know, not one she talks a lot about, and we could certainly explore it more. You know, and so again, the true evil of both Nazism and socialism, within regards to totalitarianism, is their ideological, logical focus. What she's saying, and you're right to point it out, is that the sort of content of racism is unhuman, right? As she says, barren of authentic spiritual content. Whereas in socialism, there's something that does appeal to the best of our tradition, namely a kind of equality, and that's important. Your other point, which is on page 358, is a good one, or is a good question, and one that you have to sort of struggle with a bit. It starts on 357, where she says logicality at the bottom. Logicality is what appeals to isolated human beings, right? So we make a distinction actually between three: isolation, solitude, and loneliness. Isolation is sort of the state that people are in a tyranny, where where you can actually be with other people, you can live with people in your house, you can play chess with people. The tyrant doesn't really care if you have a vibrant, rich private life, but they want you to not organize politically, not gather in any kind of public way. And so that's what she means by isolation. So logicality is what appeals to isolated human beings, for man in complete solitude, without any contact with his fellow men, and therefore without any real possibility of experience, has nothing else he can fall back on but the most abstract rule of reasoning. So isolated and alone, not having any kind of public engagement. And she then quotes Luther, who says, "A lonely man deduces one thing from another and carries everything to its worst conclusion." Then she says, logicality, mere reasoning without regard for facts and experience, is the true vice of solitude. So I will tell you that to me, this is a bit complicated. She then says at the end of the next paragraph, beginning of the paragraph after this, solitude and loneliness are not the same, right? In solitude, we are never alone, but are together with ourselves. Well, if we're together with ourselves in solitude, logicality would not be the true vice of solitude. So what I took it to mean that logicality is the true vice of loneliness and despair. Solitude can, as she says on the next page, she says solitude is not loneliness, but can easily become loneliness, and can even more easily be confused with it. This is on page 359. Nothing is more difficult and rarer than people who, out of the desperate need of loneliness, find the strength to escape into a solitude, into company with themselves, thereby mending the broken ties which link them to other men. And she cites Nietzsche's Mittagswald, da würde eins zu zwei, when Nietzsche, in a sense, moves from loneliness to solitude when he imagines himself in conversation with Zarathustra in Sils Maria. Logicality, therefore, in the quote you offer, Susan, mere reasoning without regard for facts and experience, is the vice of solitude. I think it's the vice of loneliness, which can be confused with solitude. But I'll say if anyone else has a better idea than me. This is one of those situations where I would say, look, this is not a published essay. It's a typescript. I'm not 100% sure, how to unravel that for you. I'm sorry about that, Susan. Susan Wright, you're next.
Yeah, hi, Roger.
Hi.
Can you, okay, good.
I do, yes.
There's a couple things. One is 2 points, which I've struggled with when Arendt talks about the breakdown of moral structure. I've often wondered what specifically is she speaking to. I know she uses words like the traditions lost, etc. But is she also referring to things like, God is dead? Is she talking about those types of traditions? That's my first question around Arendt in general, because she refers to that breakdown of moral structure over and over again. And that's always kind of got me wondering. And then the second thing is, maybe we can all speak about it as we go forward. In the essay, which was fascinating to me, is this distinction between the citizen and the individual. What is she called? Just the public citizen versus the private individual. And to me, that's very much a struggle today. And I suppose it always has been. But certainly today, when I look at what's going on around the world, even with, COVID, all types of issues, right? There's the citizen and responsibilities as a citizens, and then there's the rights of the individual. So those are kind of, I'd like to explore that more, but I'd like your take on when this breakdown of moral structure. What do you think she's trying to get to? And it sounds like she's mourning it in a way.
Yeah, okay, the mourning it again comes back to the way I ended what I started with the sort of introduction that I gave, which is, in one way I can see why you say she's mourning it, and in some sense, but I don't think she is. And I think it's important to realize why she's not. The breakdown of moral structure is the breakdown of the pillars of our tradition. It's the break with tradition. It's the loss of customs. And remember, I said that Montesquieu says, if you lose laws and institutions lose their legitimacy, you still have customs, and that can save you. But if you lose customs, then you're dead. And what she's saying is, and this was actually explicitly said in the last essay on understanding in politics, which is, why is it that our tradition has not saved us? Why is it that when this happened in the 20th century, there weren't customs and there weren't pillars of our tradition in Christianity or Europeanness or German, a German culture and German heritage? Why didn't these things rise up and put limits on totalitarian ideology? And her answer is, because this tradition is broken. It has no power anymore. And we can't, it will, when it's easy, when times are easy, when we don't have totalitarianism, we pay homage to it. We say, oh, we're religious, or we love American ideas, and we love, good old German work ethic, or whatever it is. But when the chips are down, as she says, this tradition is hollow. It no longer has a role to play. It no longer can step up and provide those kind of pillars or banisters. You said, does she mourn this? And I don't think she does. In a way, having lost it is sad, if you liked it. if you like those traditions. But in her view, they're not coming back. And the worst thing we can do is kind of have this nostalgic hope that we come back, because in doing so, we actually don't confront the reality of our world, and reconcile ourselves to the fact that we live in a world without pillars, without a tradition. And it's going to take, generations, centuries maybe, to build some sort of new tradition. But whatever new tradition we build, she says, is not going to be like the last one. It's not going to be Christianity. It's not going to be, American constitutionalism. It's not going to be nation state or whatever. We don't know what it's going to be. What she says in a lot of her essays, and what I've been pushing in this group, is the way it's going to be built is that we have honest conversations and talk with each other. And in talking over time, and honestly over generations, we will find things we agree on, and we will build new pillars slowly over time, new stories, new monuments, new institutions that over time get to be persuasive and taken as true by enough people that they come to be a new tradition and a new pillar. Mm-hmm. But she thinks that will happen, she says, but it's going to take a long time. And if we get impatient and say we don't have time for that, we want to sort of fall back on Christianity or Judaism or Judeo-Christian or Islam or whatever it is, she says all that does is actually make things worse, because those pillars will not ever be rebuilt. And as soon as the chips are down, they'll fall apart again. So maybe that helps on your first question.
Yeah. Thank you.
On the second question, I'm glad you asked it. I skipped over it somewhat on purpose because I figured someone would ask about it. And this is probably the most controversial part of this essay. She's talking here about what she calls this double standard between citizen and individual. And it raises probably the question in Arendt's work for which she's most criticized today, right? Which is this distinction between the public and the private. Yeah. What she says here is that this is common to her work, and she takes it from a lot of people, including Montesquieu here, that the public world is a world of equality, where in the public I have to treat everyone equally. And while that's part of justice, and that is true, it's also the truth that in all constitutional governments, namely in all free government, most of what the public law says is negative. Don't do this, don't do that. It doesn't usually tell us what to do. And thus it leaves a certain realm open to us to live our lives freely and uniquely as individuals, not as public citizens. What she says is that it is that you can define Philistinism, right? As demanding that we impose equality not only in the public world, but in the private world. And that she wants to argue that freedom demands that we understand that even something like the categorical imperative, even the law of equality, can only rightfully be demanded and imposed in the public world. And when we try and say that we have to make people not only equal as citizens, but make them equal, in matters of wealth, if you're a Marxist, mm-hmm. or in matters of race, if you're an anti-racist, and we impose that not just in the public world, but in the private world, she thinks not only is that unfree and Philistine-like, it will destroy the human ground, which allows for a new rooting of a form of government that would be virtuous or true to our time. The point she's making here is that what law and power can do is not create the principles and the human, the anxiety or the equality or the distinction. It can't create the sort of underlying human condition out of which a people emerges to be free. It can only create a private sphere in which those that human condition can be allowed to grow over time. And so obviously this is going to be controversial. This is the part of her work that leads her to defend people who in private lives are sexist or racist or classist. It allows her to defend income inequality. It allows her to defend people who want to hang out just with other Jews or just with other Muslims or just with other whites or just with other blacks. And she says, as long as you treat people in the public world as okay, that's okay. But as soon as you get into the private, you're attacking that basic foundation of society. And the common, this is on page 335, where she says, on the first paragraph on 335, at the bottom of it, she says, it is in this non-public sphere from which the sources of action and motion, as distinguished from the stabilizing structural forces of law and power, spring. So you need this private world in order to form these sources of action and motion. And then at the paragraph that begins at the bottom of the page, she says, the phenomenon of correspondence between the different spheres of life and the miracles of the unities of cultures and periods, despite discrepancies and contingencies, indicates that at the bottom of each cultural or historical entity lies a common ground, which is both fundament and source, basis and origin. And so what she's saying is, you can't create that common ground through law, through power. You can't impose it. It has to freely emerge. And if you try and use relations of law and power and impose them on people and tell them, you actually can't believe this because it's racist, or you can't believe this because it's sexist, or you can't believe this because it's anti-Muslim or anti-Jewish, and you can't do this because it leads to inequality. To inequality. If you do that, you don't allow that common ground to emerge. And thus, there's no way to build again or form those foundations, those traditions that she thinks over time are going to have to be rebuilt.
And Roger, do you think that she thinks in those discussions, those kind of public spheres, that those discussions would lead to this common ground towards the arc of justice? I mean, because what we see happening today in reality is so many people voicing racism and things that they had not voiced before, simply because the political climate was not correct. And, this, what he says, what I think. So all of this is now emerging, and I grant it's a process without a doubt, and I think it will take a long time. But, I wonder in that tension between what private individuals claim to truly believe in terms of races, et cetera, how that will eventually get funneled into some grander citizenship. I don't know. And it's a rhetorical question. I'm not looking to you.
No, it's not a rhetorical question, Susan. And I think I would say you're half right and half wrong in my understanding. More right than wrong. I'll explain what I mean. I think you're right that there is a way, an Arendtian way of seeing what's going on now as as an important contributor to understanding in politics.
Yeah.
In the sense that after the first civil rights revolution of the 60s, or second, if you want to include the Civil War, certain truths emerged among a certain class of people, and other things were suppressed. And you're seeing, obviously, right now, a lot of that repressed, unconvinced, unpersuaded racism reemerge. I think, from Arendt's point of view, talking about it and talking with people in the public sphere who fundamentally disagree and who are racist is exactly what politics is about. She doesn't think we should tell people that they can't be racist in private, but she does think they have to engage publicly in ways that are respectful of all of us as public citizens. And I think that to the extent that may or may not be happening and might happen, that is the kind of public discussion that might lead to increased understanding and increased plurality and new structures and new ideas. Where I think I disagree with what you said, and it's just a mild thing, is she doesn't think that's related to the arc of justice.
Yeah.
She doesn't believe in progress. She's not convinced that the next one will be better than this one. It might be different, but there's no reason to think it's going to be better. There will be other injustices that are covered up in the next iteration of this, and they may be better, maybe worse. She doesn't think that's a conversation really worth having. She's not a progressive thinker. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate the discussion. Great. Thank you, Roger.
Roger.
Rick. Oh yeah, go. Who said that?
It's Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Nancy. I just wondered what if there's no expectation of improvement, what drives the enterprise of writing books and being a public figure and caring? That's my question.
The need to understand. I mean, Arendt always said that she thought and wrote things for herself to understand what was going on. It was always for her, that was what drove her, the need to understand. Now, she did want to resist totalitarianism, right? And I think, clearly she thought totalitarianism was evil. But I don't think she, but I mean, she sees that as what came next. It's not progress. And, whatever we do next may prevent totalitarianism, but there will be other problems that will emerge from it. So, I mean, yeah, she's not, the idea of progress or the arc of justice is for her, ends up becoming this sort of self-driving ideal in which we actually don't aim at anything particular. We just want progress. And in fact, it may be better not to progress, but to, stay where you are at some point and live in a world and not constantly need to improve the world. And it may be, she says, the drive to improve the world constantly that is part of the problem. I mean, if totalitarianism is caught up with this idea of movement and constant need to make man new and remake man, it may be that progressivism may be part of the problem, insofar as it constantly demands that we uproot the roots we have in order to make it better. And in doing so, we weaken roots and we weaken our home.
Can I say something?
Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, I mean,
We got the three Susans. We got first.
a triumvirate.
It's a triumvirate.
No, but I've been thinking, a couple of things. One is that in some ways you could look at Hannah Arendt as a libertarian, with a very like small government, very, more expansive role for the private. And then what you were just talking with Nancy about, though, it seems to me that, you can be sitting in the left corner and feel everything is fine. And just, and a lot of traditions are great, and let's just keep things the way they are. But then across the street from you, are people who are being oppressed by that system. So I think partly for me, the question is in Hannah Arendt, where does the public and the private meet? And isn't it inevitable?
She's not a libertarian. I mean, she's not in anything. Let's start out. But she's certainly not a libertarian insofar as a libertarian thinks the government is the best government is the government that best governs least. She actually believes that participating in government and actively engaging in government is and self-governing is one of the highest and most dignified ways of human flourishing. At least as I understand libertarianism, it's largely saying I want to just be left alone by the government, not actively participate in the government. So she's certainly not a libertarian in that sense. Okay.
Ask a question.
Yeah, I mean, I know we have a list. Does this go on with the same conversation, Shadi?
Yes.
Okay.
So on that note, if it's so difficult, isn't it I don't want to be pessimist. Is it possible at all to just
Is what possible?
To expect all society to have these progressive ideas, to absorb these progressive ideas, to want to grow, to want to be accepting, not be racist, not be misogynist. That's my question. Always when I read Arendt, I feel like it's not possible. That's what I feel from it, that she wants that to happen, but I feel like it's not possible.
It's a good insight and question, Shadi. What does she want to happen? I mean, it's not an easy answer. I'm certainly not going to speak for Arendt. What does she say she wants? She wants to think what we are doing. And for the most part, that's how she lives her life. There are moments of exception when she gets involved in politics. But she largely wants to be able to think and write. Does she when we read this book in our next iteration, The Promise of Politics, when we read the essay on the tradition of political thought, Introduction to Politics, we'll see that she doesn't think we should aim to get rid of prejudice. Just to give you an example. Prejudice is part of humanity. There'd be no such thing as humanity without people having prejudgments and prejudices. And so, Arendt's not, certainly not a progressive, if progressive means get rid of all prejudices. She does think we need to resist racism, which she thinks is different from prejudice, insofar as she says here, racism is which is not to say prejudice is good, it's just human, but racism is an ideological, logical consistency of superiority of one race over the other. that will then seek to be actualized through terror, or slavery, or something along those lines, that you need to resist. But prejudice itself, no. In fact, the effort to reduce prejudice, she thinks, is very dangerous. It could lead to seeking to destroy humanity, since humanity is always going to have prejudice. So she's complicated. I'm not going to run away from that complication. I think, as Susan mentioned, I think in her first question today, she thinks race thinking in general is a bad prejudice to have, whereas class thinking could be a good prejudice. Both of them bad ideologies, but one good prejudice, one bad. But the way to deal with prejudices is talk about them, not suppress them, as she says in that essay we're going to read in The Promise of Politics.
Hey, Roger, it's Susan Wright again. Could I just interject, because it's on this subject, quickly?
The only issue, Susan, is I got a lot of people with hands up.
No problem. Yeah, no problem.
I'm going to try and move on.
That's no problem.
Rick, now you can go, Rick.
I want to go back to a couple questions you said in the very beginning, but just as a way of feeding into the statement you just made about progressivism is also possibly part of the problem, which I think you're completely right. That what we call progressivism today, which I'm a fan of, and I think most of us probably are, Arendt would find really highly problematical. But at the beginning, you had the question about, why this essay, or what was Arendt's point? And I think what she wants to do, not just simply understand that, okay, now I know why Germany did what they did, now I can get on to something else, but in a way to show us that that is now part of our world, and that's part of the world that we live in. And not that now that I understand it and then, okay, that's what they did, I'm sure glad that's not me. I think she wants us to be able to look in the mirror and say, you know what? I got a little totalitarian guy living right inside of me. I think she wants us to be able to say that, because that's how we're going to be able to prohibit it or work against the kind of thing. And I think
Rick, I think that's a great point. Let me say yes and no, right? I think what she wants to say is this we are living in a modern world where this disease of loneliness is there, and it can affect masses. And a lot of people can, out of this disease of totalitarianism, be tempted by disease of loneliness, can be tempted by totalitarianism. She would never say, and I can tell you this because she writes about this in response to the criticisms of Eichmann in Jerusalem. She will never say that there's a little Eichmann in all of us, or there's a little totalitarianism in all of us. She's going to say some people, when they're confronted with loneliness and they're feeling abandoned and alone, will have the strength to retreat into solitude and build a conversation. And some won't. And she'll never say that all of us have totalitarianism in us. And so I just want to be clear about that. She doesn't want to say with someone like Stanley Milgram that because some of us succumb to totalitarianism, all of us are sort of little totalitarians. I think it's an important distinction that she makes in her work. Okay. But I think the general point you're making is right. She thinks we're living in a world where it is an ever-present temptation, and some of us will succumb to it, and some of us won't. And part of our job is to make as many of us think and be aware of the dangers of totalitarianism, such that we won't succumb to it. And what she says is the way to do that is not by telling people how bad it is, in the sense that it's going to create horrors or pain for people. The way to do that is to make them aware of how it is a radical denial of freedom. Because in the end, if people think they're free and they're going to be free, they're going to be okay with putting people in cages at the border. Rarely are people going to risk their lives for morality of other people, for morality. But she thinks that if they understand deeply that freedom is at stake, they'll risk more, and they'll resist more. And that's, I think, part of the point of the essay.
Okay, but here's where I was going with that, though. I don't mean it literally. I like to say things like that because it gets attention. Well, I think like we need to be able to slap ourselves in the head. But what I meant by that, though, is what the heck was it now? This idea of ideology. She says, to her, one of the central problems is, the role of ideology, or the role that ideology can become. And in a certain sense, everything, or I would say everything is an ideology in some certain sense, but that's where the potential danger lies, because an ideology becomes solidified and we follow that instead of something else. And that's kind of what I meant, all of us have a little inside of us, because all of us, in a certain sense, follow an ideology or like an ideology or have some kind of framework. But she likes having laws, and she's conservative in the aspect that she likes to have laws as like this framework or the walls. And then us as human beings, we bounce back and forth and have this big mess in between these solid walls that like surround us. But with an ideology, what happens, those solid walls become more solidified and kind of like crush in, and the public realm becomes diminished. And now we just have the social realm, which she really doesn't like, because that overpowers everything and it becomes solidified. And I think that's what the potential danger of ideology that she doesn't like, and that's what causes the big problem. So for instance, nowadays we say, and both sides say, what do we need to do? We need to control the courts.
Yeah.
That's the problem. That's the wrong way to look at what it means to be a human being in society. We think we need to control the courts, maybe because the other side's trying to do that, but that's the wrong way to look at what it means to be a political human being.
You got it right, Rick.
When the progressivists and the conservatives both think that we need to control the courts, they're both guilty of the same flaw of what it means to be a political human being. And that's what I meant. We all have this inside of each of us.
Thank you. Because we're really short on time, I'm going to move on. Dina?
I was wondering whether it's possible that the next ideological movement seeking to destroy plurality takes a non-governmental shape. For example, a more of a social one. And if so, are there self-destructive forces at play that Arendt doesn't address because her conception of the desire to understand is based primarily on that which is articulated, so that she, for example, there's a short brief discussion in this very rich essay where she seems to refuses to engage with psychoanalysis. So if there are destructive forces that we are not yet aware of, does that not play a role as well?
It's a good question. I mean, if I understand it, it's somewhat the question of, and I think Rick was actually pointing to this to some degree, of social totalitarianism as opposed to totalitarian government.
That's right.
And this is a big discussion right now, especially about the left, right? I mean, is the left becoming a social totalitarianism? In the sense that it is creating a kind of culture where if you say the wrong thing, or if you step out of line, or if you're not on our team, we sort of exclude you. And so there's a lot of people on the right who argue that the left has become a kind of social totalitarian entity. The Arendt certainly does recognize.
I mean, my question is not. I mean,
Hello?
Yes.
Did I lose you? Your question is not what?
No, it wasn't limited to a distinction between left and right, which may be upended by a type of social totalitarianism to begin with.
Okay, I mean, but what Arendt, is going to say that in its sort of larger issue, the question of social totalitarianism is the question of conformism, right, or conformity, and it is a problem. And it is a problem insofar as Rick was saying, the social world, the world of, newspapers and universities and clubs and things where we sort of socialize that are not public and political and are not private, increasingly occupy more and more of our lives, and come under a kind of conformist ethic. The danger there is not that we'll have one totalitarianism across the whole country, because different social institutions will have different ones. The danger there is that we will all spend so much time in our sort of social silos, in our social world, that we will allow our public world and our private worlds to wither. And we will cease to both have the kind of rich, vibrant, unique private worlds that make us human, and will increasingly cease to engage as equals with people who are different from us in a world of plurality. And we will simply live most of our lives in kind of social institutions where we agree with everyone, and we are never challenged to become deep or thoughtful in meaningful ways. And that's the danger, I think, of social totalitarianisms, as you're saying. Okay. James.
Yes, I've been very impressed with in the readings that we've done, that I've been witness to, with how Arendt analyzes states of man's being and his behavior and his dynamism. And I wanted to ask today, is there a place where Arendt specifically defines what man is, the ideal state of man is? And then today, you ended your piece with that totalitarianism gives us a chance to be at home in a world that is broken with no truth. And I thought, wow. And then where you moved today was that ideally, it's not a time to be progressive or to be radical. The goal is to live in understanding, to find understanding, to hold understanding as primary above being progressive or being fair or being radical. That the challenge of being human is to be understanding. Would that be what the ideal human is that I was searching for earlier today?
Great question. So after we read The Promise of Politics, starting in the next semester, we're going to start to her book, The Human Condition. And in that book, she's going to say that there is no human nature.
Oh, I love it.
That's not something we can say anything about. But she's going to say there is something called the human condition. It is not transhistorical. It is not. It is always conditioned by the world into which we're born and the world we are in. But she's going to try and argue that in the world that we live in, starting, sometime, with the Greeks, so it's a kind of has a certain kind of Occidental history to it. She's going to say that a certain condition of humanity emerged, where there were certain aspects of what it meant to be human, certain faculties and activities that included a number of things, and she's going to list at least 10 or 12 of them. But 3 that she focuses on are the faculty of the activity of labor, work, and action. Thinking is going to be one that she says is there too, but maybe too demanding. And And so she's going to explore what she means by the human condition and ask whether that human condition is undergoing a threat and a transformation or a challenge in the modern world. And she's going to argue it is. That we're in the process in the modern world of seeing a real transformation of the human condition that has largely been the same for over 2,000 years. And that's sort of what that book is about. So I'll defer the answer until we read that book.
Do you think her image of totalitarianism eliminating the space between people and solidifying it, do you know what I'm talking about? Is that kind of like the Roman fascists, those poles surrounded by sticks tied together to protect that inner core pole? There's no space.
No, I don't think it's like that. I think what she's, when she says that it presses in like an iron band, what she says is that everybody has to sacrifice themselves for the law. I think we didn't really talk about this, so I'll bring it up. What she says is that it used to be you had lawful government and lawless government. The problem with totalitarianism is that it's actually lawful, not in the sense that it follows positive laws, but that it follows these higher laws, the laws of race, nature, racism, or the laws of history, classism, and that in doing so, it forces everybody to follow these laws. And it may be that today those laws put Germans over Jews, but once all the Jews are gone, you're going to still have to follow this law of nature, and you're going to have to move. And it may be that the next time it's certain Germans over other Germans. And so her point is that everybody is sort of turned into simply a fungible man or a person that can be fitted into whatever ideological requirement is needed. And there's no escape from that. There's no private world. There's no place where the law doesn't reach. I'm going to go to the last question that I'll try to answer is Ayala, because we're going to run out of time. And then what I'll do is let people, if they want, ask their questions and let other people respond. Ayala?
Okay. Yeah, it's basically echo first to Susan. You asked, I think, why does Arendt sees the normative structure as more fundamental to society than the law structure. And the way I understood it is that the law basically lays external boundary. It's a boundary setting. It's based on enforcement, therefore on conformity, whereas the norms are more fundamental as they are internalized, they are based on freedom, and therefore they are agreement based rather than conformity. So, and that's basic to any society, primitive or not. As far as the other, Susan, you brought the difference between Stalinism and fascism as two totalitarian regimes, that's right. And it came to my mind Umberto Eco, who wrote in 1995, Your Fascism, and he made an interesting distinction that fascism is a type of totalitarianism, just as Stalinism or communism was. But the difference is that Stalinism was put the ideology not in service of the people, but above people, and therefore homogenized, was based on homogeneity of the people, of its own citizens. whereas fascism was based on distinction among its own citizens, based on mental defective, some homosexuality, Jews, and so forth. So both imposed an ideology that's over humanism with a very tight ideology that's non-permeable. I'm done.
Great. I'm going to say yes. And thank you for that great comment. And what I'm going to do now, and this is a request that I had from some people, is we have Ken, Stephen, Carolina, and Jason with hands up. Why don't you guys ask questions in that order, and then I'll let other people try and have a conversation and respond. I'll stick around, but anyone who wants to go, thank you for joining us. Keep reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week.